Well, then you went there, Sir John, and did you find that your first experiences with the New York Philharmonic, that the confidence which you had, and without which, of course, you couldn't do any of your work, was not only justified, but enhanced by contact with these musicians who were new to you, but who had obviously had a pretty rough training and experience with Arturo Toscanini before you?
Yes. Well, you know, I just want to go back one thing. It suddenly struck me a queer thing. You know my reading habits, CB?
Yes.
That they're mostly medical books, biographies, and thrillers. I'm an ardent Nelsonian.
Yes.
And I thought it rather a significant thing that I sailed for the first time for America on October the 1st, Trafalgar Day. So England expects, etc., etc.
Yeah, yeah.
Sped me on. I remember that morning of my first rehearsal. Naturally, up to then I'd had a certain amount of apprehension and worried greatly about this assignment. But I remember that morning when everybody was so jittery, the management, everybody, and that suddenly when the time came to walk on the platform, I think I was the coolest man there. And I remember the first piece we rehearsed was the Carnival Romain of Berlioz. And we seemed to make a contact with that orchestra straight away. And that remained to the end of my stay, and I stayed for 7 years, which was the longest tenure of any conductor, apart from the great old man himself.
Yes.
I was there for 6 weeks, I seem to remember, and it's obviously a sort of trial. But at the end of that time, I was given a 3-year contract with the orchestra, and as I say, I remained with it for 7 years. And one of the most touching things, CB, I must tell you this, I returned to America last year for the first time for 15 years. And I went back to my New York orchestra, and I was rather surprised and very happy to find there were 33 left of my boys, because 15 years is quite a long gap. And when I went to my first rehearsal, there was the same old doorman who embraced me warmly when I got there. Of course, all the 33 of my players were still there. Those who had been pensioned since I'd left were also there. And of those who had passed away, their widows or their children came to greet me. I think you must agree that that is something a man can treasure.
Absolutely.
Now, in the last 15 months or so, America alone, I've traveled something like 31,500 miles. This has been actually drawn up for me by the airline, so I'm not romancing, and conducted 16 American orchestras, including all the very major ones. Of course, some are of different degree of quality than others, obviously, but I must say that everywhere I've found always some quite remarkable talent. And one of the greatest differences since I first went there, that now all the leading players, whereas in the early days there used to be very distinguished importations from abroad, are now their own young American players. Some of them of foreign parentage, but this points to their wisdom of importing great players in the past. Because you know, CB, I hold the view that talent is rampant everywhere. Young people, if they have the right incentive, if they hear the right kind of sounds, they will soon emulate. So with this wisdom of importing great players from Europe, they have now created their own school of playing. And that, I must say, gave me enormous pleasure. But I must tell you another thing. Some of these importations from Europe were very striking personalities. For instance, I had a wonderful little chap in the New York orchestra called Labate, who was Italian, who was the first oboe. Little chap about 4 feet high. When he used to stand up to address the conductor. The rest of the orchestra used to shout out, "Come on, everybody, stand up when you speak to the conductor," because he looked much shorter standing up than when he was sitting down. And he was quite fearless individual who would even argue with Toscanini about phrasings and insist in Rossini overtures he knew how to phrase them much better than the old man. But he's one of these Italians, almost like the Italian comedians you see on the films, who speak that particular brand of broken English, which I find enchanting, and which is quite their own. And he could never bear to pronounce anything very long. For instance, even Mozart, he always referred to as Moz. And I remember one morning, and this story went all around America very quickly, we were rehearsing for a sort of chamber orchestra concert, and we only had 2 symphonies on the stand, a Mozart symphony and a Schubert symphony. And when I came in to start the rehearsal, he stood up and said, "Maestro, we play Moz?" I said, "No, Schub." He was a great little chap. I came home in 1942, because I was in America, you must remember, when the war broke out.
Yes.
And I was naturally feeling very far from home, kind though my American friends were. My mother was in London, my family, we read about the bombing, and I was really unhappy, not musically, but personally. Now, I must tell you, one of my great friends was A.V. Alexander, First Lord of the Admiralty. I was dying to get home because it was impossible to travel in those days. So I wrote to A.V. and I said, "My dear fellow, if you can get me a passage home," I said, "I pay my own fare, I conduct any orchestra you like, I don't want any fees given to charity, as long as I can come home for a little bit." I had 10 weeks to spare that summer. So he apparently went to see the Prime Minister, and apparently Mr. Churchill said to him in his inimitable way, "Well, if he's full enough to want to come home, let him come." And they got me a passage on a Norwegian freighter, a 3,000-tonner, and we took 25 very exciting days to come in a convoy from New York to England. I remember, it's curious enough, that the ship was actually destined for Manchester Canal, and we were literally bringing home the bacon, because it was a ship full of bacon. But we stopped at Liverpool first, and I thought I'd get out there and get home as quickly as I can. And I remember my first act on setting foot on English soil after 3 years was to go into the refreshment room and have a pint of warm bitter. It tasted revolting, but I was home.
Sir John went back to America, and it was there in 1943 that an invitation reached him with all the drama of the invitation that had first taken him to New York. Would he come home and take on the job of rebuilding the Halle Orchestra, which had become a mere shadow of its former self? He came.
Instead of the orchestra of about 70 players, I'd expected to find there were only about 23 or 24. Now you can imagine at that particular moment in the war, when the whole of the male and female population had been recruited for needs of the war, where was one going to look round for players? And the only chance I had was the very young, the fairly old, and what I might call the slightly maimed. I only had about 5 weeks, and we started an intensive series of auditions up here in Manchester, lasting 8-9 hours a day, from which nobody was barred, because I daren't. And the talent that came to light was really quite extraordinary. But in a way, I am very grateful, because perhaps no great orchestra has ever been started from such tiny beginnings. And I like to feel, perhaps as a critic once said of a performance of mine of a great symphony, it was grand to see the acorn developing into the great oak.
Yes, it was the performance of Eros Sibelius number 5, I think.